Hi, my name's Daisy Abbott, and I work at the School of Simulation and Visualization at the Glasgow School of Art. My presentation today is on how do we convert vicarious learning in games into dialogic learning. So, unfortunately, ironically, given that the theme of this mini track is about dialogue, this is going to be a 15-minute monologue. I'm going to cover the postgraduate teaching and learning context, which is where my research takes place, and it's where the educational games that I've designed take place as well. I'm going to look at how do we get dialogue to happen within as opposed to alongside game-based learning. And I'm going to do this by looking at a case study with some theoretical reflections, and I'm going to propose some mappings between game mechanics and learning mechanics, which I think create good recommendations for dialogic games. Okay, so my context of teaching is in research skills. I teach only research skills. It's the only teaching I do, and it's at a postgraduate level. Now, it's generally accepted that research skills are extremely important for students, both to develop their academic capabilities, but also to help them as they go into the wider world. And as a result of this, obviously, you'll know of them yourself. There's many universities run many different courses which are devoted to developing higher order thinking. And this is particularly common at the postgraduate level. You have critical thinking, methods and methodologies, all these kind of generic research skills being taught as explicit modules in their own right. Now, in my opinion, and the literature confirms this, it's a learning context which particularly benefits from dialogic learning. However, this is what teaching research skills looks like. It's been called into question in the literature, how effective are these courses? The motivation of students in studying research skills always seems to be quite problematic. And this is from a literature review on the subject by Early. Students consistently underperform and give low ratings in research methods module evaluations. It's bluntly put by these scholars that research methods courses are courses that instructors hate to teach and students hate to take, despite my best efforts. And it's also recommended that teachers need to use active learning approaches to teach the course in a way that provides hands-on exposure to research methods. So it's difficult to teach research skills. And all my best efforts in using games in my own teaching have shown this and really emphasized the need for dialogic methods. So there is a strong rationale for using dialogic games in this context, because games have a huge overlap with the general principles of dialogic learning. They are active, they are collaborative, collective in some way, either in a collaborative, a competitive, or a cooperative kind of way, depending on the game. Both games and dialogic learning provide reciprocal dynamic interactions. They're both purposeful or goal-directed, and they both use feedback to cumulatively build towards a goal. So, what do the roles of various people look like in games that currently exist for research skills? Now, there aren't very many of them. This is already a research gap. There are relatively few games specifically focused on research skills, and particularly focused on research skills at a postgraduate level, which is where all my work takes place. And they generally have a role format that looks something like this. You have the instructor, who is then facilitating the game and contextualizing the content of the game and feeding information down to the players, the students. And I include in this my own games that I've designed in this context. For instance, How to Fail Your Research Degree or On the Shoulders of Giants. They have this format of the tutor acting as a game facilitator, but also as a source of knowledge and to contextualize the content of the game. So dialogue definitely takes place in these games, but it's almost always suggested as an out of game activity, a debrief activity. So how can we move that dialogic learning into the game itself? What we really want is the game to look more like this, for all the players to have that egalitarian dialogue going on that we know benefits dialogic learning. So that raises the question then, what is the role of the teacher? And how do we actually design games to deliver this sort of model? So, are there any dialogic games for research skills then? Well, spoiler, I haven't found any when I was researching for this piece of work. If you know of any, please do tell me about them. But although many of my own games and many other games include dialogue in the debrief or as a kind of adjunct to the game activity, I was able to find no games at all that actually include dialogue explicitly within the game mechanics of the game, within this particular field of teaching research skills. So we're going to look now at the case study. It's a game called On the Shoulders of Giants, which I designed to help my students with the process of undertaking a literature review. It's a mod of a commercial game, a tabletop game called Meeple Circus, which you'll recognise if you've ever played it. The game was specifically designed to maximise vicarious learning. That means students learning from each other. And dialogue was mentioned in the rules document as a debrief activity or as something to do kind of during pauses in the game. And all the information about this game is in the publication noted here. So I started to look at how could we turn this game into a dialogic learning activity, a dialogic game. So my approach was to look at the relationship between learning mechanics and game mechanics. Now, the literature tends to agree that we need to focus more on this relationship, even with the recent advances in game-based learning, and lots of recent publications are now talking about this. It's still not yet mainstream. So what are the kind of how can we explicitly link the learning design with the game mechanics that we're putting into these games? So the approach that I took, and I was really trying to unify the gameplay with dialogic learning principles. So I combined the use of gameplay loops from Guardiola with a formal model, and the model I chose was the LMGM framework, the Learning Mechanic Gamework framework by Lim et al. So if you don't know what a gameplay loop, it looks something like this. Here's one for snakes and ladders. That's just a really simple example. They can be this simple. But used as a research tool, gameplay loops allow formal descriptions of how the learning happens, what interactions are going on at the time that learning happens, or the time that you think learning is happening. It allows us to model the gameplay interactions at both a macro and a micro level. And it allows, particularly for this context, it allowed me to identify specific interactions within games that might prompt dialogic learning within the game as opposed to alongside the game. So I did gameplay loops for 3 games. They're all dexterity-based games, and they're all competitive games with ostensibly one winner. These were my shortlist games for the mod called On the Shoulders of Giants, which I showed you before. We're not going to look at all of them, you'll be relieved to hear, but we'll just look at one in detail to demonstrate the process. So this is a gameplay loop of Meeple Circus with the learning mechanics shown in blue, the game mechanics showed in orange alongside, and I also added these green darker background tags, which are what I saw as opportunities to increase the learning behaviours within Meeple Circus as I was modding it. I went back to this gameplay loop diagram and I then highlighted it with a D for dialogue on any places where I thought were particularly suited towards dialogic learning. So what we can see is that the reflect and discuss learning mechanic across all three games analysed was highly appropriate for this kind of dialogic learning. And almost always this reflection and this discussion was aligned with game mechanics such as match, measure, reward, and feedback. It's also clear that dialogic learning can take place in other areas in the game. We have, in particular, we have the plan learning mechanic, which is almost always associated with strategy and planning as a game mechanic. It's sometimes also associated with a design edit game mechanic if there's kind of some elements of design, and there are in these games some elements of designing the structure that you're trying to build out of the little pieces. So it's kind of associated with design and edit as well. And what was really notable from all three analyses is that the dialogue requires players to collaborate and therefore needs players to be working together in teams. So if you're in a competitive context in a single player, you don't have anyone to have dialogue with. And so that's restricting the learning. So that we'll come back to that later, but we do need some sort of collective goal-oriented approach in order to have fruitful dialogue occurring. And the other one that comes up all the time is feedback as a game mechanic and as a learning mechanic, so they're highly associated. And this is the proposal I came up with for interactions for dialogic learning and mechanics. So the first thing to notice is that there isn't a simple one-to-one mapping between game mechanics that directly lead to learning mechanics that directly lead to dialogue. It can be seen here that certain game mechanics provoke these learning mechanics: plan, analyze, and reflect. Now, dialogue can be involved in these processes, but it doesn't have to be. So what I've done is I've split the reflect, discuss learning mechanic proposed by Lim et al. And I've made a new mechanic called dialogue. Now, these three things here can involve dialogue, but they don't have to, and that's quite important. What then happens is as you engage in these learning mechanics, these cognitive learning mechanics, you then start to get the dialogue, and they can lead to other learning mechanics such as consolidate, ownership, and responsibility. So there isn't a way really that game mechanics directly provoke dialogue. They tend to do so through the medium of some other form of learning, and that's quite important. There are also so there's these three categories then: the game mechanics over here, the preliminary learning mechanics, and then the resulting learning mechanics. It also should be noted that some game mechanics in my modelling here, I believe, inhibit dialogue. So time pressure, dexterity, competition all inhibit dialogue. Generally, this is it's thought to be competing cognitive load. It's very difficult to have a fruitful dialogue while I'm trying to balance a meeple on top of another meeple. And I also felt that instruction can inhibit the students' ownership over the material. You know, that students take much more responsibility and ownership over their learning journey if they're coming up with stuff themselves. So instruction may be necessary in some contexts, but it can inhibit this kind of self-reliance, the ownership over the learning journey. So the recommendations then. First, let's look at the role of competition within dialogic learning games. Dialogue requires communal goal-directed behaviours. So that means cooperation or collaboration. Competition inhibits dialogue between players. So if this doesn't mean to not have competition as part of the mechanics of your game, but it does mean that you should perhaps try and focus instead on game mechanics such as collaboration, cooperation, communal discovery, and role play. It's important to notice that competitive games can have a lot of advantages. They're very exciting for students, the novelty of them, and they can contribute to focus as well. So if you find that you want to use competition, that's absolutely fine, but do what I did and group your students into teams. So then they have dialogue within the team, and then they can have dialogue across teams when they're reflecting or questioning each other's answers. When you have these three intermediate cognitive learning mechanics that lead to dialogue, plan, analyze, and reflect, try and make sure that the context they're taking place in is as dialogic as possible. So you can have, planning dialogue within teams. Reflect can happen between teams. Um, and you can also include game mechanics that aren't necessarily always seen in this, certainly in the genre of games that I was looking at, which is physical dexterity based games. So you could ask players, for example, to role play during the scoring phases to critique each other's strategies or each other's answers. And that would deepen and consolidate understanding. So egalitarian dialogue between all the participants, it increases the focus on ownership and responsibility, which as learning mechanics are very powerful in giving students the agency over their own learning journeys. So try in dialogic games to minimize the tutor or the game facilitator's input. So I'm suggesting that you restrict instruction and guidance purely to how do you play the game and leave the content development to the students themselves, to the players. If you are using any questions and answers as game mechanics within the game, make it between the players, not led by the tutor, because that way you avoid any sense of a right and wrong answer, and instead you let the players engage in the dialogue. Then we don't want to throw away the tutor's expertise, obviously. So if you feel that instruction or further guidance is needed, then we can move that part out of the game itself and into the debrief. So if the game must include game mechanics that inhibit dialogue, and by that I mean those things that place a cognitive demand on the player that might shut down their ability to engage in dialogue, try and split this cognitive load between team members. So you can add in turn-taking game mechanics to ensure that everyone gets a go at each part. And while one person is concentrating on one thing, the other two team members can be having dialogue. Something like time pressure, playing against the clock, that can also inhibit dialogue, but it can increase the excitement and focus for the players. So just make sure that you balance these inhibiting game mechanics with the other game mechanics that maximize the dialogue. Okay, so to summarize then, the learning mechanics that lead to dialogue in my model were plan, analyze, and reflect. And in almost every game analyzed, they were strongly associated with these 5 game mechanics: strategy planning, design and edit, match, measure, and feedback. These interim learning mechanics then lead to the consolidation and the responsibility overall game mechanics supported by dialogue. So it's proposed that games which already encourage informal dialogue can be adapted in the way that the case study here was adapted to move away from the observation learning mechanic, which is vicarious learning, into dialogue, and to move away from guidance into egalitarian discussion between players. It is a limitation of this research that it took place during the pandemic. So although my plan had been to test it with students to ensure that the model actually held out during gameplay, I wasn't able to do that. So at the moment, it's completely theoretical. So I will need to test it in order to kind of validate this model. And I would really love to hear any comments or questions. Thank you very much.